southern boundary is near Pacific. That's, I don't mean Pacific Ocean, that station. This side of Gitxsan, you see. And from that we go east on the Copper River. That's the Gitxsan territory. And so then we go north, we follow that, and if you go to Smithers, you will see on the left-hand side, halfway between Smithers and New Hazelton. There's cars for sale signs. That's our boundary, you see. So then the Gitxsan, they go across the Buckley River there, and that's at its Aches territory, and they go towards the Babine. And then from Kissagas, Malulach and them, they go west from there, almost to Babine. Well, in fact, they pass Babine. They past Babine Lake, and they go into the driftwood country and go north. So then not but Yep, he takes in Bear Lake territory. His boundary is a little east of Bear Lake. And when I was a boy, I always hear about Bear Lake, and I asked my mother, who are the people that live at Bear Lake? Oh, people like us. I said, what do you mean? Well, he said, up. See, that's League Up, and we are very close. And I said, what language do they speak? The same as ours. So that probably in 1920 when she told me this, you see. So then that's where the Gitxsan language is spoken right there, Bear Lake. Then we go north, headwaters of the Skeena, headwaters of the Nass, and we go west of the Nass, you see. So this is where the Gitxsan people, and down the Nass, I don't know how far down on the, around Mesiaden or someplace. They go as far as Bowser Lake. So this whole territory, the Gitxsans don't just live on the Skeena River or Gitxsan. We've taken a big territory. The people that live there, that's on the Bell Irving, Getamgaldo. They live in Hazelton now. Skawil, Sanos, Nigap. Those are the people that come from there, and they've moved into Hazelton, just like everywhere else, where they move to where they can get supplies. So that's where we speak our language. And last summer, when we were up at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, we were talking to Michael Krause. He's the professor there, the head of the language department there. And he was talking about this, when he talks about the language, it takes in Gitxsan, Nasba'a, Tsimshan, and Tsimshan South, which Tsimshan South goes as far as Clem-2, you see. And he said, you people have an isolated language, meaning when we go to Moorestown, it's just like a wall. You cannot understand those people. We go to Babine, it's the same. You go all the way around, it's the same, come down the Nass on the coast. Haida, people. I was saying, I was only a small boy when we were in Oceanic. I might have been 5 years old. Glenval people were there, Kitsikipur people were there, and Haida were there, and they were speaking their language, you know, and I think it's the first time I've heard people speak a different language. And we sort of laughed at it, you see. They were probably laughing at us too. But their language is altogether different. It's again, you're up against the wall. So, and I suppose it's the same at Clem-2. Okay, we go to Kitimat, the Heisles. That's a different language too. And he said the language, when he's talking about the whole area, is 3,000 years old or more. That's how long we've been here, this language. And nobody, it doesn't mix in with anybody else. We've been just staying in this place and probably guarding the place, you see, and using that same language all the time. So I was saying that's very important to know that, where, you know, that like the English language, I think is only 1,500 years old, and which is made up of so many other different languages. So this is it's nice to know just where our boundaries are and where our Gitxsan language is spoken. So that was why we could see that in the few years to come, the people who were born in homes spoke the language at home till they're grown up. There's not too many left. We might say 20, 30 years. I've got relatives 30 years old. I try to talk Gitxsan to them and they don't understand me. So we've got about 20 or 30 years to gather our language. And that's why it's so important. And this is why we started on this. So we did a feasibility study. See if we can go ahead and do something about it. And we got good response from different people that have been in the language business, linguists, and so on. One of our good breaks was, I think, from Rosalind Wally. Gave Barbara the name of a botanist, Brian Compton. And so we got that, it was the Tsimshian botanical names and that, and it also has Gitxsan. And there was research work done here in 1920. And people that I knew, Bob Robinson, Luke Fowler, there was up in here. And in that book, I'll give you one example of what that book is all about. As you know, we learn our language at home, and nobody tells us, you know, we know yeah or something like that, so that is spring salmon. But in this book, it says amadal, this tree, amadal, that's a cedar tree. And it means that the hatal, that's the inner bark of that tree, is good. Good for lots of uses. Sfana, that's the mat. Dich, that's the bags, baskets, coats, ropes. That atal has lots and lots of uses. And then the tree itself, you can make ink boxes, totem poles, skeersen, that's the rack for drying the berries. And that you time together with atal as well. So this tree is higher than any other tree. We have another name for it, simqan. That's why you call it simqan, and you hear simgiget, simtsos. So that, and you could see for yourself that, as I was saying, you could make canoes, totem poles, all kinds of things out of the tree itself. That is a very important tree, and we were lucky to have in our territories. So that was one of our good breaks, was getting, I think it was 100 pages of that. So that was a pretty good start. So then we got to the stage where Barbara contacted Mr. Rigsby. And it got that he can come here, and we can get finances to get him here. So Mr. Rigsby is here. That is our big break. Our other big break is this dictionary here. This thing is priceless. This thing is absolutely priceless, because with years of work, which started in Kispiox, with Chris Harris, Johnson Williams, there was a Morgan down here, Bernard Hindle and Sally, they took an important part in this, and Lonnie himself. Now, to develop this alphabet would take a long, long time. It's put us years ahead. If we didn't have this, we would have to start from the bottom. And to be able to do this dictionary, I mean the alphabet, the English is 26 letters. Our alphabet in here is over 40. That's letters and combination of letters. I cannot express my gratitude for the people who were involved in this, because You'd have to know the language. You'd have to study the language. And then sit there, saying it, and making up that alphabet. You really have to. So this is the work of Lonnie Hindle and Bruce Rigsby, and we've got Bruce Rigsby with us. And Sally Hindle is still alive. Sally and Bernard, they had no finances. Bruce and Lonnie. And Sally and Bernard helped finance them. That's really something. So what I was saying is that this thing is absolutely priceless as far as I'm concerned. It is. Without this, we'd have to start from the bottom. But this is all in order. That Gitxsan dictionary, they've borrowed this alphabet too. That's what they've used. So it is as good as we can get. So with that, I won't go much further. I don't want to take up too much time. For the young people here now, we're going to say reading and writing or spelling. Now, in this length of time that you've got, I don't know how much we can accomplish with that. But don't worry about that. The committee got the school set up to give you first-class foundation. It's just like building a house. We always use the house because that's a good example. You have to have a strong foundation, a level foundation, and a square foundation before you can get a good house. So this is what you're going to get at the school, the foundation. Don't worry whether you're going to be able to write it out or not. Some of you that have had the schooling might be able to do it, if you could read it. But so Bruce will work with you on the foundation, and that's exactly all we want. We don't, and relax, don't tense up. Now, some of you will have little dialect, little difference, but that's not much, and that's nothing to worry about. Absolutely nothing to worry about. When the dictionary comes along, our committee will figure out a way. You see, they have, like in the Gitxsan dictionary, some of the pronunciations are different. And they will put Prince Rupert after it. That's where the word comes from. Or HB Hartley Bay. We'll be able to do the same thing here. So that's nothing to worry about. Now, some of you young people that used to wear those earphones all the time and blow your eardrums crazy. Now, if you're a little bit hard of hearing, move up or ask questions. Ask it to be repeated because pronunciation is real important. Very important for you. So, I think with that, I'd like to say, I'd like to see out of this group, or maybe a future group, we have a linguist in our race, among the Gitxsan people. Somebody to continue on this. It's very important and very interesting. So with that, thank you.
You hear about Germans, you hear about English, you hear Irish. They all got their own language and their own land. We're Gitxsan, and our language is our identification in God's eyes. They got to be proud and remember that. So that this language program means something to you. That's your identification. Just like anybody in the world, different nationalities have their own dialects, their own language, their own identification. That's the exercise. Bruce, when I tell you his side on that, it's almost the same. It's a different one. So, Bruce, you can take right over here and get busy.
I Linguistics at University of Queensland, Anthropology and Linguistics Day and a Laos Day. John's body no will da ox dem quis willis of these and gigi slochs but not with them willing. Hesum with a Saxon medicine so will access them will attempt some argach. Lanskodi will say Godim, I will Hasagam Dimdach Gat some Algef, Nedim Deed Gal Kod. Am Slomschkum Algechan, Skidim Dip Amagadit, Nedis Quat, Dim Dip Willard Nadach Dohot Algech. Sim Gastink Haslastun. Dim Hoyik am Xewamach to do. I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be here with you to help in this Samagich work. It's very important work right now to do all we can to strengthen the situation of Samagich. I'd like to thank Barbara and the steering committee and other members of the Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en Education Society for inviting me and employing me in this work. I'd like also to thank the Gitlinkach School and the Gitxsan Teacher Training Program for providing the venue, the place for all of us to come together and to work together over the next 4 weeks. Let me tell you a bit more about myself now. Some of you have known me for years. Others of you, I think, are probably just seeing me for the first time. But I've been a university teacher for almost 30 years, and I'm the professor of anthropology at the University of Queensland, which is the 3rd largest university in Australia. We have about 25,000 students. I'm the head of a large department, the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. We have about 25 full-time academic staff, half a dozen office staff, and altogether about 150 graduate students, people working on master's degrees and PhDs. So I spent a lot of my time as an administrator, but I also teach. I teach anthropology, and I teach linguistics. I also teach Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies. The indigenous people of our country, Australia, are Aboriginal people whom I'm sure you know about before, but many people don't know that there's a second indigenous people who live in Australia. They are the Torres Strait Island people who live in the Torres Strait, which is the narrow body of water between the northeastern tip of Australia and the independent country of Papua New Guinea. So I teach Aboriginal and Islander studies. It's a very popular subject. We often have 200, 250 students in the classes. I don't know how things are here in Canada now, but in Australia they don't teach the real full history of how the white Australians colonized Australia and dispossessed the indigenous people. So that a lot of what we teach in introductory Aboriginal and Islander studies is what I call remedial history, just setting the record straight for the white students coming in. Most of my research outside the university now is with 2 Aboriginal groups on Cape York Peninsula. I live in Brisbane. Queensland's a very big state, by the way, where I live. Queensland's a very big state, shaped something like that. I live in Brisbane, down in the corner. It's about midway up the east coast of Australia, and I work up here on Princess Charlotte Bay, or the Cape York Peninsula. It's 1,500 miles. Takes me 3 days in my old truck to drive up there if I don't fly. But most of my work is concerned with land rights issues, with working with people to get land back, land which is their land, has always been, but which only recently the Queensland government passed a Land Rights Act. And just this last June, I was asked to come to a ceremony where people I work with got back a small block of land, inalienable freehold title. So they have a place to live now, and no one can ever again hunt them away. Police actually took them away by gunpoint in 1961. But as you know, I also have a long interest in you Gitxsan people and in your language, Simalgach, and in your culture and your history. I came to this Gitxsan country first in 1966 with my family. We drove, I was just finishing a position at the University of Toronto, and we drove about 5 days in the early part of May, and we arrived in Kispiox about the middle of May. Chris Harris, Wilson Duff, who's an anthropologist, and I had been writing, and Wilson had written to Chris Harris about me, and I had exchanged a letter too with Chris. So when we pulled into Kispiox, we had Chris put us into a cabin. I had my wife and 2 small children, and we just moved right on into the life of the village. And Chris arranged, he was running the store then, didn't have a lot of free time himself, but he introduced me first to Smogadam Gnu, Johnson Williams, and then to Smogadam Mukalish, Jonathan Johnson, who also was working at the school but would come on the weekends and evenings. And it was mainly those 2 men who first taught me some Algach. But Chris also spent a good deal of time with me and always supported me in my work. I'm sure it wasn't just because he liked me and wanted to be polite, but I'm sure, I know Chris worked with other anthropologists too, that Chris had a feeling that someday the situation would change. He had a very keen sense of justice and was concerned very much with what the old people always called the land question. That already then, for 90 or more years, Gitxsan people had been concerned about the land, so that Chris taught me some language himself, but over the next few years he often talked with me about the land question, and I remember he had maps from John Adams, the work that he'd done with John Adams, and he was concerned to make sure that I spelt the names correctly on those maps that he had made. Chris also would think of old words, see, to make sure that we didn't leave it out. I also, that first summer, went with Johnson Williams over to Gitnanku, or Gitanyao, and there he introduced me to the late Fred Good and his brother Rufus Good. I think they were very surprised that I could understand a bit of language, and I didn't speak it very well then, but they were very helpful and took me in, and we checked out a lot of the names, chiefs' names, names of places in the book that Wilson Duff had worked on with Constance Cox and the chiefs at Gitnamyao, the history, laws, and territories of the Kitwan-Cool. So, and then in 1969, I was lecturing, I was visiting at Harvard University in Linguistics, and Wallace Morgan, from this village, came to New York for a couple of weeks to spend some time with John Adams and Alice Kasakoff, his wife, and then he came up to Cambridge, up to Harvard, and spent a month with us, and lived with us in the apartment that we had rented. We did a lot of language work together, but for about 2 weeks he came in a course in field methods in linguistics. There would have been maybe a dozen students there doing some algebra. So people like Wallace were well-traveled, very knowledgeable, sophisticated people, and he had the chance then to teach about the language at Harvard University, which is one of the oldest universities in North America. I also became very close friends in those early years with Sally and Bernard Hindle. And Sally, in fact, in some ways is responsible, was the first person responsible for the writing system, because when I started out doing the work, I was doing it just as a professional anthropologist and linguist. I didn't know that anyone would be interested then in learning to read and write for themselves, and would see that as part of the key towards strengthening the situation of language. That was a time already in 1966 in Kispiox, the children talked English when they played together. Just a few children, like Jonathan's children, Beverly, and others, would talk amongst themselves, to one another, but with the other kids, whether Gitxsan or my children, who were Amksiwa, they talked only English. But Sally, about 1967 or so, said, "Look, I'd like to learn to read and write my own language." And so I can remember over a period of about a week, we'd get together every evening, and I started out teaching her the technical alphabet, the one that I used as a linguist for writing the language, which uses some letters borrowed from Greek, like this right here is called a lambda, but it's the sound that you have at the end of a word, like geet, 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 geet. The name for the sockeye salmon when it turns red, or what, cluck is lower lip. But using those technical symbols, which any linguist would recognize, and which we use when I write technical papers for professional journals, I use those. That was a bit daunting, a bit off-putting, a bit strange, so I had to start thinking about trying to develop an alphabet that used letters that were familiar to people. And that was when I started thinking about developing the new alphabet for Gitxsan. And in 1970, Lonnie Hindle came down to Albuquerque, where I was teaching at the University of New Mexico. Lonnie hadn't finished high school then. He'd just gone through 8th grade. Some of you may remember something like a color bar operated in the schools, and there was a fair bit of racism then. In fact, I can remember when I first came, there were places in Terrace where Native people couldn't be served because of racism. But Lonnie couldn't get into university here in Canada then. They didn't want to hear about him. And so he came down to New Mexico, and the dean interviewed him. And he spent a year. He got funding from what I think was a First Nations fund or something like that. It was one of the early funds. Spent a year at the University of New Mexico and did quite well. And it was during that year that we went through my field notebooks and put together this little dictionary. We wanted to put together something that had the new spelling system in it so that people could see it. We didn't consider that it would be a final product or the definitive product, but rather we saw it as the first step in what you can see now is proving to be a long haul, a long struggle, a long period of working to strengthen the situation of the language. And then the next year, UBC couldn't act quickly enough in order to get Lonnie to come back, and so he then shifted back to British Columbia. And actually, when I wrote the introduction to that dictionary in 1972, I was in Australia. I had the chance to go and take up work overseas, and so I did that. And in 1975, with my family, we moved permanently to Australia to take up a position at the University of Queensland. I guess I might have been thinking about my old age, but where I live, it's subtropical, very warm weather, good for older people who have rheumatism or that sort of thing. I grow bananas and mangoes and passion fruits in my backyard. I can grow tomatoes throughout, tomatoes we call them in Australia, tomatoes here. I grow tomatoes throughout the winter. But I never forgot about my stenographic work, and whenever I've had time, I've gone back to it. It's something that's very dear to my heart. And in 1981, 82, in the middle of the year, I had a full year's study leave, sabbatical leave, from the University of Queensland. And we spent the first 6 months down in Victoria at the BC Provincial Museum. They had a linguistics division then. And what I did during that time, that year, well, in the 6 months I was down there, was I went through all my notebooks. See, I have a big stack of notebooks with materials that I've written down from your old people. So it's not just chiefs' names and so forth, but with words and sentences and so forth in it. And during the time I was in Victoria, I took that material out of my notebooks and put it on, 5-inch by 7-inch filing cards, so that I could find it. If I go and try to look in a notebook for it, I can't find it. But by putting it on slips that are in alphabetical order, not English alphabetical order, but the order of the Semitic alphabet, I can find words. And quite often I can think of a word, but I can't think of its English meaning. Sometimes the other way around, I've got the English meaning, but I can't quite find where I've got the Semitic word stored. But during that time, I made up a series of slip files, so at home, I couldn't bring them with me now, they're way too much, but I've got 6 boxes with about 1,000 slips in each, and each slip has anywhere from 1 word to maybe 10 or 12 sentences that illustrate how you use those words. So that is prime source material, resource material for doing a dictionary. And at that time, it was before microcomputers came in, and so I was still doing it on paper, but one of the tasks I have in coming years, and which I want to be talking with you about while I'm here, is instead of putting material on paper, we really should be working with the new computer technology. I've done 2 Aboriginal languages on the microcomputer, and it's very fast. The computer, for example, can search through, well, to give you an example, one language I work with, I had 7,000 lines of text, and the computer can go through it in less than 30 seconds. And the other thing for older people like ourselves, I know the computer's a bit daunting, but I tell you, you put the kids on them, they go to town, and they do very well, and they'll take over from us and carry on the work. But I wasn't really in that year in 1981-82 aiming then to put a dictionary together. I was aiming to write a grammar of somehow. A grammar, just to give a simple sort of definition, a grammar tells you what the rules are for putting words together. It's no good just to know the words of the language, because if you try to put them together in the order of English, it doesn't sound proper, it's not correct. Your language has its own rules of grammar, and that's what I've been trying to study, to work out over the years. In many ways, you can think of my job as like the job of a code breaker during the war, trying to, seeing a body of material and trying to figure out what that code for linking sound and meaning is. So during that year, I did a fair bit of work on writing a grammar, but I didn't finish. We came up here for 2 months then, was here in January and February of 1982, living with Sally and Bernard, my wife and myself. Our children are grown now, so we were able to leave them behind. And I was checking things out, learning new things. I didn't actually get to do much writing while I was here. And actually that didn't bother me because it's more important to spend time with people. And it was at that time that some of you here remember we did a workshop for about 2 or 3 days at Gitxsan, a workshop similar to this, except it was very short. And then the 1st of March in 1982, I came down here for about 3 nights, and Roger Johnson and some of the younger people came along, and I talked with them about writing the language. But my time went pretty quickly then, and I didn't get the grammar finished. I just got a good start, and I just got back onto the language, really. So I went back to work in Queensland, and in the university we get study leave after every 3 years of teaching. We're supposed to get 6 months off at full pay. Can't go off and have a holiday. You're supposed to work on scholarly things, academic work. So that I had study leave again in 1986, the first half. And actually in 1985, the Tribal Council had asked me whether I would work for them on the land case. And together with Jim Carey, who some of you may know, Jim Carey works on the Wet'suwet'en language. Jim Carey was my student. I was chairman of his PhD committee at New Mexico years ago. But Jim Carey and I wrote the expert opinion evidence brief on language for the Tribal Council for the case. And I was here for a month, the month of May, well, mid-May till mid-June in 1986. Very proud of that work, and I wear this pin which the Tribal Council distributed to all the people who worked on that with a lot of pride, and I quite often Australians see this and they say, well, what's that for? And it gives me a chance to talk about the Gitxsan people and the case. Then I have the feeling, just to talk about that, I know that the appeal has just been heard, but I have the feeling that in the end justice will prevail. If we don't get the right decision on the appeal, it will go on up to the to the federal Supreme Court. I feel that not simply because I know what's right, but I know also from Australia, where the land question is a very important thing and something that all non-Aboriginal Australians have got to come to terms with, because until we do, we live as thieves in our land because we didn't pay for it or acknowledge it, its owners. But there was a major case announced by the Australian High Court the 3rd of June. It's a real landmark case in Australia called the Mabo case. The Mabo case. Eddie Koiki Mabo was a man from Murray Island in Torres Strait between Papua New Guinea and the tip of Cape York Peninsula, who with several other leading people on Murray Island brought suit in the early 1980s in the Queensland courts and fought it all the way through to the Supreme Court, to the High Court of Australia, saying, we never signed a treaty with you. You say you've acquired sovereignty and acquired title to our land, but we say that we've always been here, that our system is still in place, and we want it recognized. And on the 3rd of June this year, the High Court ruled in their favor. The High Court said, well, the Crown acquired sovereignty in 1879 in Torres Strait, which means the Crown acquired the right to make laws and so forth. But in international law, when a country acquires sovereignty, whether by settlement or by conquest, the ownership of the land stays, so that, for example, when America and Britain and Canada won the war against Germany and the war against Japan, the ownership of land in Germany and Japan didn't change. The same people continued to own their land, so the same principle should operate with indigenous people. And the High Court used the term native title, not Aboriginal title, but native title. And it said that native title continues to exist in Torres Strait and elsewhere in Australia where it has not been extinguished by the Crown. The Crown has the right to extinguish native title, but it can only do that by proper legislation and by paying compensation. And so now in Australia, we are going to, over the next 4 or 5 years, see a series of court cases and lots of legislation to clean up the land situation. In some cases, it won't be possible. It's not possible for land to be returned. Compensation will have to be paid, but there will be large parts of the country which will go back under Aboriginal ownership. And already in the Northern Territory of Australia, about half of the state is owned inalienable freehold title. The other thing about that case that's important is that the Crown ran the argument. They said, look, the people who lived in Australia and in Torres Strait when Captain Cook came there in 1770, and again when the settlers settled at Sydney, the First Fleet, in 1788, the Crown ran the argument that because the people who lived there weren't as many of them as there were in Europe, and because they didn't practice agriculture, they didn't put the sweat of their brow into the land, they ran the argument that the people were too primitive. They didn't have enough social organization to own the land. You recognize that's exactly the same argument that the Crown ran here, and Justice McEachern said that your forefathers didn't have much social organization and that life was poor, short, cruel, and brutish, and so forth. Well, I think, and I know that in these sorts of things, the the English-speaking common law countries like Canada, Britain, America, and so forth, and Australia and New Zealand look to each other's land law a lot, and the Mabo case will be very important in deciding the appeal. And basically, if you read between the lines, our judges said that Justice McEachern was wrong, and that what his decision basically is racist. It says that some people are not as good as other people. They don't really own the land, but they're just like animals roaming over the face of it. Well, you know and I know that's not right. The old people owned the land. Your native title, your Aboriginal title, still exists. You can see it at feasts and at ceremonies. You can hear about it, as I have, from your old people. And I feel personally that when the day is over, that we'll see justice and we'll see recognition of that title. But that's a bit about myself, so that you know who I am and how I come to know something about Somalia and Gitxsan culture and ways of doing things. I know often anthropologists have a bad name, linguists too. There's some people who say that we come in and just take the material off and publish it, and it doesn't do any good for the people who provided it in the first place. But in my professional life, extending over 30 years, I've always tried to give back something for the very precious gifts that people have shared with me, by things like the dictionary work, the language work, and so forth. And that's why I'm glad to have the chance to be here with you now and to get this important work underway. And it's not just something that will come from me back to you now as we talk about writing the language, but I'll be learning from you. I hope to regain some of my fluency. When I speak, I have to write down ahead of time what I'm going to say. I do that in English too. I get a little nervous sometimes, but I don't speak freely quite often. Well, after I'm here for a few weeks or here for a couple of months, then it starts to come more freely. But I'll be learning from you, and I'm looking forward to that. And I want to stress that the importance of laying a good level foundation and a square framework when we build a house in order to make the house last and to stand up to the elements. The same is true when you're designing a writing system for a language. You want to lay a good foundation. You want to make sure that the foundation is square. So I'd like to talk about some necessary, some desirable features of a Somalia alphabet with you. I'd like to stress the importance in my mind of having a single alphabet that we all use, no matter what village we come from. As we'll see, the pronunciations are slightly, some words are slightly different amongst the villages, but it's possible to spell those words differently, or in some cases you use the same spelling but use different pronunciation. In the same way that in the English-speaking communities throughout the world, the written language in Britain, in Canada, America, and Australia is the same, and we can read one another's English and not have problems with it. We use the same system. On the other hand, there are some times when you need to have, say, your own dictionary. So, for example, in Australia, we don't use American or British dictionaries anymore. We have our own. I think there's probably a Canadian dictionary too. But the writing system's also important in a language situation like the current one, where many children are not learning Somali as a first language, or they hear it and come to understand it, but they're not using it. And to some extent, they will probably learn some of their language through writing, through reading it, particularly if they get an immersion program up and running in the schools. So it's very important that the words be written and spelt accurately, so the children will learn the spellings we teach them, but they also will learn to pronounce the words from the spellings. Because you'll see, unlike English, where the English writing system, doesn't directly relate to the way you pronounce words. Take the sequence O-U-G-H. O-U-G-H, could be pronounced off, like in tough or rough, but oo as in through. Write some of these. Pronounce ow as in plow, and so forth. We'll see that it's desirable in writings for each letter to stand for a single sound, or for each sound to have its own letter. So there'll be no silent letters, and there'll be no letters that are pronounced in more than one way. Also, the good spellings make it easy to see and identify the parts that make up words and sentences. We'll see that many words, that words always, nouns and verbs, always have a root. They have a fundamental core part that signifies meaning, and then we'll have various what are called affixes that attach to the root that tell you whether I'm doing something or you're doing something there. Now, I'll try to do, as I say, I'm aware of the differences in the way people from different villages speak, and in general there's a difference between the Eastern Gitxsan and Western Gitxsan. I'd like to put both spellings on the board whenever there is a difference. If I miss out, please call my attention to it. Well, to move on into the material I've got here, we need to recognize that English is the standard language. I'll abbreviate language with LG there, of Canada, and it's the standard language that's used in all the Gitxsan communities, in the schools and so forth. Gitxsan people use it when speaking with non-native people and with most other native people who speak other languages. There, I would think, be very few people who speak only Somali anymore. When I first came, there were a few old people who didn't have English. There may be a few people like that now. But most Gitxsan people, and certainly all your younger people, become literate in English and learn the English writing system. So this makes it desirable for adult classes like this, and in designing an alphabet, to try to build on English literacy skills and knowledge to the greatest extent possible. Thus, the first point I want to make with you is that the Gitxsan alphabet should use the English letters that are closest to the Somali sounds. The alphabet should use the English letters that are closest to the equivalent sounds in Somali. So, for example, we'll find that there is a P sound, a T sound, K sound, M, N, L, and so on. We should use these letters of the English alphabet rather than, say, use, technical symbols from formal linguistics and so forth, which are a bit daunting. It's also worth saying a bit more here that if we lived in another country, we might not use the English alphabet. For example, in Mexico, the great majority, the national language, the standard language in Mexico is Spanish. But there are many different Indian peoples who are the indigenous people of Mexico and who speak their own language, like Tzotzil, Tzaltal, Nahuatl, and so forth. And they go to school in Spanish, and for them it would make absolutely no sense to base the alphabets, the writing systems for their language on English, but instead on Spanish, which they in fact do. And I should tell you a bit about this alphabet that we use. It's not really, well, our English writing system. We call it the English writing system, but we generally don't refer to it as the English alphabet. The alphabet that we used is commonly referred to as the Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet, because when English was developing as a separate language, it used to be together with German. They started out together, and the first English materials were written about 600 or 700 A.D. By monks and priests, and they borrowed the alphabet from Latin, but they could have borrowed from other sources. The Greek has a different alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet, which is used by Russian and so forth. But anyway, we use Latin. And I want to point out that there's no single way the letters used in the Latin alphabet will vary. For example, in English, the CH we generally pronounce as ch, ch. And if you learn Spanish, CH is pronounced as ch too. So in Spanish, the word for much is mucho, mucho. On the other hand, in Italian, CH stands for a K sound, so that the wine that you buy, that's spelled with CH, is pronounced as Chianti. It's not Chianti, but in Spanish, in Italian, the CH stands for a K sound. They use the Latin alphabet. In French, the CH stands for a sh sound, so the chou, C-H-O-U, in French, the word for cabbage, chou. For those of you who know any linguistics, I'll write the technical symbols right here, the way these are pronounced. And in German, the CH sound is very close to two sounds we have in Algach, but we won't want to use CH for those. But there's a word in German, ach, 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 which has a ch type sound, the same sound as in ach, ach, the food, the old food. The technical symbol for that is X with a dot under it. And then there's the sound as in the word ich, which means I or me, which is very similar to the sound in ich, which means fat in Algach. The point I'm trying to get at here is that we try to use letters from the English alphabet that are closest to their equivalents in the Gitxsan alphabet, but you shouldn't regard these letters from English as being exactly the same or equivalent. And I want to get across that in developing an alphabet, you can say, well, look, I'm going to use this particular letter to stand for this sound. So long as you're clear about it, it's fine. It's not written in stone. The CH has to be pronounced as ch, as we've just seen. But, you know, different languages make use of those two letters in different ways. So the first point, then, is that the alphabet should use the English letters that are closest to the Gitxsan sounds. Closely related to this is the second point, is that you want to use characters or letters that are found on the English Standard Typewriter keyboard. Letters that are found on the English Standard Typewriter keyboard, or I should say now on the standard English computer keyboard, because you're using computers in schools. It is, however, possible, you know, to get a French keyboard or a Spanish keyboard, but I don't think it would be a lot of trouble to develop, you know, special keyboard with special sounds. If we can use the English keyboard, we're that much further ahead. Also, another consideration is to use letters and letter combinations, because sometimes we have to use letter combinations. That don't require backspacing on the typewriter wherever possible. Unfortunately, we'll see there are certain kinds of back sounds in your language. K with the underline, the G with the line drawn through it rather than under it, and the X with the line drawn under it. This is the sound at the end of ek. This is the sound at the beginning of ach. And this is the sound at the end of ach. And they're different from plain K, and plain G, and plain X. This was something I couldn't get around. Could have used different technical characters, but as I say, they're a bit intimidating and daunting. There doesn't seem to be any way around this. So these three letters do require backspacing. Also, we'll see there are certain sounds like the hard M, the hard N, and the hard L, which originally in the, how are they done in the little dictionary? In the dictionary, Lonnie and I originally wrote these hard sounds with the hard sign, the apostrophe right here, instead of calling it apostrophe. Most often, I'll call it the hard sign, because it tells us that the sound is hard. Originally, when Lonnie and I did the dictionary, we wrote the hard sounds like in goitmach, and nach, and lach, or seitlach. We wrote those with the hard sign immediately above the M, N, and L, and that meant you had to backspace in order to do it. And the Nispat still write the letters that way. But Zay Powell, when he and Russell Stevens were working on some algif in the mid to late 1970s, they found that it was possible to write the hard sounds, the hard M, N, L, Y, and W, by putting the hard sign first. So that for a word like goitmach, you can write it, with the back G, O, Y, hard sign M, A, back S. Oitmach, oitmach. And you see, you don't have to backspace then if you put the hard sign before the letter. Put the hard sign before the letter. Those of you who are just learning the language, I'll explain a bit later on how you make these sounds, because they're not found in English. They're specific to the alphabet. Okay, now a fourth principle or point that I want to make is that a proper alphabet for Somalic has to fit the language, has to be designed for it. You just cannot take, and you mustn't try to force Somalic into the English writing system as the early missionaries did, because the language has its own set of sounds, it has its own combinations of sounds. I'll talk to you another day about previous work on the language, but one of the men who did a considerable amount of work on the language and spoke the language very well was a missionary in this village, Reverend Price, Alfred Edward Price, Reverend A.E. Price. He used some special letters for writing Somalic, but he failed to recognize that there's a difference between hard sounds and soft sounds in the language. So that Reverend Price, and by the way, when I talk about these older people, I'm not trying to run them down or to criticize them negatively, because we really stand on their shoulders for the good work they did. But the situation was different when Reverend Price was here, because everybody talked Somalic, and really they weren't looking to the spelling to show them everything about how to pronounce the words, and there was enough context in reading that they could read the stuff back. But Reverend Price, for example, he wrote the word for pussycat as D-U-S, D-U-S, whereas you'll see in the new spelling, we'll write it as D long U-S, deuce, because it has a long vowel in it. But he wrote the word toots this way. The word toots, which means black, or it can mean metal, he used a D for the beginning sound there. Well, if you listen to deuce, deuce, and then compare that with toots, toot, you hear the difference between do, 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 do. They begin differently. So that in designing an alphabet for your language, we have to have at least two kinds of sounds, two kinds of letters there. A soft letter, as in deuce, and a hard one, as in toots. It's simply not adequate now to use these older spellings, although a person who already knows the language can read them and make out what is meant. So in order to design and to develop a proper Somalic alphabet and writing system, it requires that one makes a scientifically adequate linguistic analysis of the sound system of the language. It requires that one develop an analysis of what the linguists call the phonology of the language, the system of sounds, the sound system of the language. And the phonology is the very own sound system of a language. Just what are its distinctive sounds, what are its vowels. Every language, all languages will have a number of vowel sounds. Just what are the consonants of the language. And we've just seen here that there's a consonant similar to the English D, as in the word deuce, but there's another kind of consonant, as at the beginning of toots, which is a hard T, where we have to use a letter not found in, a combination of letters not found in English. And also we'll find that in the sound system of a language, there are rules for putting sounds together, rules for combining sounds which are specific to the language. Specific to the language. English has words like spin, stink, skink, and so forth there, but English doesn't have words with consonant combinations like at the beginning, let's say, a beast or bao or jaw and so forth. And you'll see that we can write those letter combinations using the new alphabet. But the point I'm trying to move to here is that myself, I did the technical work on analyzing the phonology back in the late 1960s. And I've published a number of technical papers on it in journals like the International Journal of American Linguistics and so forth that talk about the sound system of the language scientifically. And from that work, I went on with Lonnie to develop this alphabet. I've been pleased that it hasn't been found necessary to change any part of my analysis of the language or really to change the alphabet. The only changes we've made since we started were the changes, we took up the changes that Jay Powell and Russell Stevens developed. And this same alphabet, by the way, while it was developed for your Alga, has also been borrowed by or adopted by the Nisqat. To give you a bit of background, I worked in Nisqat in 1966 and 68, and in November 1971, 3 chiefs, the late Bill McKay, Reverend Hubert McMillan, and Bert McKay, came down to Albuquerque, and I taught them this new alphabet. We spent about 3 days doing that, and then we went out onto the Navajo reservation for 3 or 4 days, and they saw the bilingual Navajo schools. And it was a real eye-opener for them, seeing school board meetings all in Navajo language and the children all using Navajo. And that was a good part of the stimulus for the Nisqat getting their own school district number 92 and developing their own bilingual and bicultural program. They in fact asked me to work for them on that, but I was committed to going to Australia. But the point I'm getting at here is that the same alphabet we use for writing our Alga here is used by the Nisqat. That's because the two languages are very close to each other. I would say that they're about as close as, let's say, British English and Canadian English. You can understand one another, but sometimes you have to learn some of their words, like you have to learn, for what we say, steen, they say, malgyaks, something like that. I have a bit of trouble with that last consonant cluster. So that we wouldn't, can't just take their written materials and borrow them and use them over here, and nor could they take your materials. But you can learn a lot from each other's materials, and I hope there'll be cooperation in the future. Now, as I was saying to you, to move on here, there are some sounds, well, we try to use English letters wherever we can, but there are some sounds found in Alga that simply are not found in modern English. They used to be in English, but they're not there anymore. They were there 600, 700, 800 years ago, but they've been lost. And these provide a problem for choosing appropriate letters. And I'll put some words down. The word that means fat, heesh, heesh, heesh. The word that means to fish with a line, he, he, he. And the word that I said earlier, and I'll write it, it's sometimes called in English bulblet fern, more technical name, but he, and You might think, well, you could just use H for these sounds because they're somewhat similar to the English H in words like hat, he, him, her, and so forth there. But there already is an H sound, like at the beginning of the word hat, or guts, or Martin, or he has that. It has the H sound there. You need another letter to represent these different kinds of sounds, and these are the sounds that we write with the letter X. With the letter X, as you've seen, got on the board there. You may wonder, well, why did Lonnie and Bruce choose to use X for these different kinds of sounds? Well, we did that, we borrowed it from the Greek alphabet, where there is a letter written like this, which in Greek is called chi, but it stands for a type of sound. And have you ever, you know how this stands as an abbreviation for Christmas? You know, Xmas, we don't actually pronounce it Xmas, but in the Greek language, I'll write it like this, Christ begins not with a CH, it's not pronounced as K, but it's pronounced as Christos. Christos, where the Greek letter chi, written with an X, stands for a type sound, which is very similar to the sounds in your language. And you need to remember that the X type of sound, or the sounds that are, where we use different X's, either XXW or back X, don't pronounce that like KS in English, so that when you see a word like A back X, it's not pronounced axe. You actually, for a word like axe, water or drink, spell it on out. In other words, X stands for one of those type fricative or spirant sounds, and wherever you have KS, you actually write it on out there. It's also worth saying something about again, to make this point, that each language needs to have its own writing system. The Babine language, the language that the Wet'suwet'en people speak, has these very same sounds. It has a type of sound, it has a hu type of sound, it has a ch type of sound. But because its sound system is different, it writes these letters differently, so that in Wet'suwet'en, if you wanted to write the word for fat, to write our word using their thing, you'd write it YH instead of X. But this is pronounced in Wet'suwet'en as heesh, heesh, just like we do. If you wanted to write E in Wet'suwet'en, the Wet'suwet'en alphabet, we'd use WH, pronounced E, just like we do. And if you want to write in that language, they use KH for the back X sound. I won't go into the details of it, but it has to do with the way their language is organized and structured. So that, you know, the alphabet that's proper and adequate for our Somalia can't expect that it's going to fit Silmamach, to fit, you know, that Babine Wet'suwet'en language, because it has its own system, and there are other considerations that they take account of, that Saren Hargis and Jim Carey and Alfred Joseph, Charles Austin, and the people who've worked on that have taken account of. There's another sound that's found in our Somalia that's not found in English. The sound at the beginning of a word like slap, slap, which in Eastern Gitxsan, which means to be deep, in Eastern, and in Western Gitxsan, slap, slap, to be deep. As the sound that's made, it's not found in English, and Lonnie and I chose the letters HL. Whenever you see H and L, they go together. It's two letters, but it's a single sound. Those of you who are still learning Somalia, the way you make this sound is put your tongue up like you're going to make a T, and let the air come out both sides of your mouth. Slap, slap. And don't do it slap out one side, but you let the air come out both sides. Slap, slap, or slabich, you know, I'm tired. Slabich, slap, slap. We could have chosen something else in technical writing, and in a few languages of the world, they write that kind of sound as L with a bar through it. L with a bar through it. If you read a technical linguistic article, I write, "Sup" will be written like this, as barred L, AP. But we chose not to do that because it would have meant another backspaced combination. Another possibility would have been to write it as double L. And if any of you are of Welsh background, the name that in English, which we write as double L-O-Y-D, as well as the name which we write as F-L-O-Y-D, Floyd and Lloyd in English are two different names, but they come from the same single Welsh name, which in Welsh is written something like this, as I recall. It's pronounced Lloyd, Lloyd, Lloyd. See, Welsh has that sound, and some English people heard it just as an L. Some heard it like flip, like an F and an L. But we could have chosen double L for that, but we thought we shouldn't do that, that people would, you know, tend to pronounce it in an English type way, and that if we'd written double LAP, people would pronounce that as lap rather than as slap. So by choosing the HL combination, we thought, and I think we're right on this, that people will recognize this combination as a distinctive sound. But it could have been written another way, and in Wet'suwet'en, for example, they write the same sound as LH, so they would write slap this way and slap, you know, this way. You don't have to learn these. I'm just trying to make the point that, you know, each language needs to have its own sound system, and its own writing system has to be designed for the language itself. There also is another kind of L-like sound that's not found in English. This is the sound you have at the beginning of clot, clot, clot. the word which means mud, mud. And Lonnie and I thought that the closest English equivalent to that, it begins like a T, and then it's a hard sound, so it has the hard sound sign at the end of it, but we put the L in the middle. Cloak, or git, or clack. Do you have used clack for smear? Yeah. Okay, so clack would be written like this, with a long A and a back K. But it's possible, you know, there are some languages where they spell that sound, you know, with T barred L like this. Some people use this Greek letter for it. But we thought, and I think we were right, that the simplest way to do it is TL hard sign. TL hard sign. It's a sound that's not found, there's maybe only 25 or 30 words in Algach that has that particular sound in it, but you have to pronounce it right. Okay, next, I want to talk about the different kinds of K and G sounds. I haven't really explained the different X sounds yet, except to give examples. But our Algach has some K sounds and G sounds and X sounds that are pronounced further back in the mouth than in English, where you need to have to use special letters for them. If you listen to the sound at the end of the word for coho, ek, ek. If I say ek, 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 doesn't sound right, but ek. It's a K that's pronounced farther back in the mouth. Later on I'll go on, well, I could tell you now, it's what a linguist would call a uvular stop. A uvular stop. It's the same sounds found in Hebrew and in Arabic, and it's generally written with the letter Q. The letter Q in those languages. The word for, there's a back G, the word for tree, gun, gun. Notice if we say gun, gun, as in English, use an English kind of G, it's not right, gun. And a word which I heard Smogadam Week Ash use earlier when he was talking about the people at Bear Lake. Your mother told you that they were your cup. So we'll use that word cup, 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 which means relations or relatives. And if you take this part off right here, cup, it means part, to be part of something. So kabe, smash, a piece of meat, cup. So Gitxsan, or Algach, has a set of what are called back K, back G, and back X type sounds. Bach has a back X. To give you a word that begins with the back X sound, moose, chada. What I'm going over now is that in Algach there's at least 3 sounds that sound similar to English K and G, and a little bit like H, but they're not the same, and we have to have special letters for them, because we're going to use the plain K and the plain G and the plain X for other words then. And I actually borrowed this way of writing them from a man named Randy Bouchard, who back 20 years ago was doing a lot of work on indigenous languages and with indigenous people down in the southern part of the state. So K, back G, hard back K, up, back X. I'll be coming back to these later and teaching you or telling you how they're pronounced. I'm not trying to, I don't want to try, I won't just leave them and not talk about them again. Okay, a fourth point about letters you need for the symbolic alphabet is that there is a distinctive kind of consonant which linguists call the glottal stop. The glottal stop. And this is the consonant that's written as apostrophe or the hard sign, all by itself, not when it combines with others, but the word that means yes. Or spring salmon, ya, ya. Some people say ya, others would say ya. We'll cut it very short. How about the word for grandfather? Yeah. Okay, so write the word for grandfather as yeah. Glottal stop, E. Y, short E, glottal stop, short E. Yeah. It's a very important sound if you leave it out and just say ya or yeah. Changes the meaning of the words, or you know, there are no such words there. The glottal stop in English we have, and you know, when we say things like oh, all it is inside your throat, your neck. You have voice cords or a voice box, and it's possible to shut that voice box as the air comes out through it. That little bit of no sound you hear between those vowels, yeah, yeah, that's the glottal stop sound. And you need to write that in the language. You need to have a special letter for it. If you don't, you won't have the sounds correctly. Fifthly, there are a whole series of hard sounds, which I've alluded to or referred to, but haven't systematically talked about with you yet. Gitxsan has a whole series of hard sounds, and I'll begin with the hard T. Say to yourself the word that means sit for one person. Notice if you say ta, like in English, or da, like in chada, it's not right. It's ta. The sound pops a little bit. And I'll explain later how you make it pop. The word that means the people of a village, and the difference between Eastern and Western, tap, 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 tap. English doesn't have any, you know, it's very hard for people who just speak English to say at the beginning of a word, but you not only have, you know, like soft sound in Spalgich, but there's also a hard t, as in the beginning of tap or tap. There's a word that means 10 of animals, which in Eastern Gitxsan is pronounced as cap, and in Western is pronounced as kep. And some Eastern people have the kep pronunciation, but cap, kep. Hear how it pops if I say cap, if I say cup, kep. In the English way, it doesn't sound right. Kep, kep, it has to be cap, kep. You have to make a hard sound there. And similarly, there's a hard W kind of sound in our subject that has to be written. The word for tooth, win, win. Notice when I say win, like English, win, win. It's not right, but win, win. Win, liagui, something's tooth there. Win, you can hear the hard sound when you put it, win, the tooth of such and such. A hard W there at the beginning of the word for tooth. There's also a hard Y sound. Say the word for leaf or foliage to yourself. Jens. And if I just say Jens, it's pronounced as Jens by many Eastern Gitxsan people, and as Jens by Western Gitxsan people. Jens, Jens. Notice, yeah, Jens, not Jens, but Jens. It's like a Jensish pan, the foliage of the trees, where you can hear that like a Jensish pan, where you can hear the hard Y quite clearly. Well, you see, in designing the alphabet, you have to have, a consistent way of writing those hard sounds. Yes, Martha?
I was just wondering what was behind the placement of the apostrophe before in some cases and after in others.
Okay. You, in the, for the sounds like M, N, L, W, and Y, when they're hard, you write the apostrophe before rather than after, because there are words where you have M plus glottal stop, and you need to be able to write that. So, for example, the word for chief, Simagit, or the name of the language. Simagit. Notice Simagit, Simagit, Simagit. If I were to write these this way, if it's not hard, it would be Simagit, Simagit. Does that sound right? Simagit? Don't think so. It's Simagit, not Simagit. And similarly, Simalgach, not Simalgach. Malgach, yeah, not Simalgach, but Simalgach. The sim here we'll see means true, real, the authentic thing there. So for the M, N, L, Y, and W, when they're hard, you put the hard sign before, not after, because quite often there are words where you will have L followed by a glottal stop. So, for example, the plural of to talk, you have algach singular and algach plural. Algach, not alalgach. Alalgach without a glottal stop. You have to write it in there. Algach. Algach. as opposed to, for example, atlach, 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 not alach. See, atlach with a hard L, and then if we were to write the hard sign after it, if there were such a word, it would be pronounced as alach, alach. And there isn't such a word. There's only, to my knowledge, atlach.
So you only put that vowel sign in front of a letter when it begins with a hard M or?
When you have a hard M or hard
Beginning
N,
of the word.
well, it can be in the middle of a word, like, for example, nach, bait, and to make bait, nach. See, you have it at the beginning of the word itself. Would that be pronounced nech or nach here?
Nach is snowshoe.
Snowshoe. Okay, well, see, there's a difference between the soft N, nach, for snowshoe, and the hard N, nach, for bait. See, it's at the beginning, but to answer your question, if you want to say to make bait, where you put the se prefix at the beginning, sitnach, sitnach. But you sometimes have N plus glottal stop. N plus a glottal stop. Or
Would that be like hanap? No?
that's a hardback. Hanap.
The plural of hanap. Hanap. The plural of hanap.
Yeah.
How do you say that?
Well,
Hanap.
hanap. But some people say hanap.
Hanap.
Yeah, that's a hard N. You're right there. Right, your pronunciation is long H-A, ha, n, ha, n. But you need to, what we're getting is some technical points, but you need to be, see, the sequence of letters is such that you want to be able to represent them correctly. I mean, here's a funny one. I won't translate it. But when I was younger, I used to sin min. But see, we have sin at the beginning, min. But this lets me go on, and I'll finish up on this next point because the question you asked is a good one. There are some words in the language that have a glottal stop where if you were to write the glottal stop with an apostrophe, you would think that it's a hard sound, and it's not a hard sound. So instead of doing that, there are some words where you need to use the dash or the hyphen instead of the hard sign. The names of many villages, for example. So Hazelton is Git unmax. Git unmax. And you notice that in the way it's pronounced, it has Git people, unmax. Git unmax. But if we were to write the apostrophe immediately following the T, you would pronounce it as Git unmax. And that's not the correct pronunciation. We want to indicate that what follows the T is a glottal stop. It's the apostrophe when it's the glottal stop. It's not the apostrophe as the hard sign. So that names like Gitxsan, Gitxsan Yao, I recommend, and this works, I think it has a long A. Is it Gitxsan Yao or An Yao? Gitxsan Yao? Somebody? In using the English type spelling, but when you listen to it, what I pronounce it is Gitxsan Yao or Gitxsan Yao. Which sounds better? The long or?
Gitxsan Yao.
Okay, well, I put the two ahs there because I'm hearing it as long. But see, words like that, and I can't think of any right off. I'll come up with some other ones
Is there
later.
Gitxsan Yao? Is there a thing in the glottal stop before the W?
No, if it were a hard W, it would be Gitxsan Yao, Gitxsan Yao. But I'll tell you a word that has a hard W at the end of it, which you can use to, as a sort of keyword. Kanao, 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 kanao. And you can test that as being a hard W if you want to ask, is it a frog? Kanao, kanao, where you see the hard W then shows up in full strength. Kanao. I think I'll break now. And the question is, and some people pronounce it this way, the name Gitxsanamach or Gitxsanamach, Gitxsanamach, what relationship does that have to this name Smalgach? Well, when I first came in '66, in those early years, I never heard this term Gitxsanamach, Gitxsanamach or Gitxsanamach. And Lonnie and I were looking for a name to that would distinguish your own Gitxsan Smalgach from the Niska Smalgach and from the Tsimshan Smalgach. We didn't make the word up. I mean, old people did. But it was then that, in my knowledge, that I started hearing this, where people started using it as a way of distinguishing your language from the Niska language and from the Tsimshan language. See, they also call their language Smalgach. And really, if I understand it right, Smalgach has two sorts of meanings. One would be, it's a proper noun, the name of, the indigenous language of the three different peoples. It also can mean, one's indigenous language. So I could talk about Smalgach, my own native language, which is English, there, because it literally means true or real language. Now, you have to decide for yourselves whether you want to, to use one or another of these forms as the name for the language, or do you want to, call it Smalgach? One consideration here is that, to my knowledge, there's at least three different ways of pronouncing Gitxsan. The way I first learned out of Kispiox is Gitxsan, Gitxsan, Gitxsan. Many people in Gitxsan pronounce it as Gitxsan with a K. And the way I learned it in Western language was Gitxsan. Gitxsan. Git, people, and Xan or Xen is the name of the Skeena River, people of the Skeena River. So you really, I guess, need to decide whether you want to call it Gitxsanum or Gitxsanum or Gitxsanum. And then I was saying earlier, I know the high language that the Simgigat and Halit or Gahalit in Western used to use in ceremonies and in public, I've been told